You know how every species in the galaxy gets neatly categorized? Aggressive, hive-minded, chaotic, neutral. Then there's humanity. The ancient progenitors left us with exactly 2 words: final protocol. Not a threat assessment, not a behavioral profile. Just those 2 words floating in the archives like some cosmic inside joke. And let me tell you, when Dr. Zixth first saw it, she thought her translation matrix had finally glitched, out for good. You know how every species gets neatly sorted into the archives with clean behavioral profiles and threat assessment matrices a mile long. Dr. Zixth had pored over thousands of them. The Zaxari, hyper-aggressive. The Melanoids, passive agriculturalists. The Vorlag, 7 different sub-designations for their hive intelligence. Then she opened the human file. 2 words sat where there should have been a doctoral thesis worth of analysis. Her assistant, Blip, a fastidious little being who lived for proper labels, immediately blamed a translation error. He suggested recalibrating the linguistic matrix for the 5th time that week. Zixth disagreed. The progenitors were the most meticulous archivists the galaxy had ever known. Their records on stellar drift patterns alone ran to 17 volumes of poetic precision. They didn't make mistakes. They especially didn't make mistakes like leaving a 2-word placeholder for a species that had already colonized 3 systems. Every other entry had clear, practical guidance. How to negotiate with them, what gifts to bring, which colors to avoid wearing during diplomatic summits. Humanity's entry was a blank space with 2 words hanging in the center. It stood out like a single, stark question mark in an entire library of confident answers. Zixth ran every translation algorithm in her arsenal. She tried dead languages, living dialects, even speculative proto-tongues no one had spoken in millennia. The result never changed. Final protocol. No elaboration. No cross-references. No footnotes pointing to supplementary materials. Just those 2 words, clean and unadorned. She spent weeks on it. Skipped meals, ignored department meetings, let her other research pile up. It became an obsession. This wasn't just professional curiosity anymore. It was a personal challenge. A galactic-scale riddle left behind by beings who apparently thought 2 words were all the warning anyone should need. The mystery ate at her. What did it mean? Was it an instruction? A label? Some kind of final option to be used only in absolute desperation? The uncertainty grated on her nerves. She'd lie awake at night turning the phrase over in her mind, trying to find some angle she'd missed. Meanwhile, she watched humanity from a distance. Their ships were pragmatically designed, their communications oddly casual. They didn't fit any of the standard categories. Not truly aggressive, not peaceful, not expansionist in any predictable pattern. They just kept showing up and things kept changing around them. Which brings us to the first time Zixth saw humans in action. Not in reports or archives, but live. During the Thrakari intervention, she expected the usual messy regime change operation. What she got was something entirely different. You know what they say about hegemony collapses. Usually it's a whole production. Fleets in orbit, ground invasions, the kind of body counts that make statisticians wince. Standard protocol involves regime decapitation, confiscation of assets, and a puppet government installed within 6 standard months. The Thrakari situation started like every other. Zixth pulled up the initial reports expecting the usual metrics. 73 civilian casualties. Not great, not terrible. Just standard procedure for a species that had been oppressing half its population for centuries. Then humans arrived. They didn't bring the standard pacification fleet. They brought what they called a stabilization task force. Their ships weren't bristling with weapons. They looked more like mobile administrative centers with some light defensive capabilities. Nobody knew what to make of it. The Confederation observers expected a prolonged occupation, maybe some token infrastructure projects to win hearts and minds. Within 6 months, something different happened. The Thrakari didn't just get a new government. Their entire social architecture underwent a complete rewrite. Humans didn't install puppet rulers. They set up what they called transitional councils made up of former political prisoners, academics, and even some mid-level bureaucrats who'd opposed the old regime. They provided therapy for former regime enforcers, actual psychological treatment for people everyone else would have executed or imprisoned. They set up relocation programs for officials who couldn't adapt to the new system, giving them civilian jobs on agricultural worlds instead of tossing them out airlocks. The most bizarre part was the economic restructuring. Humans didn't seize the Thrakari resource networks. They helped reorganize them into cooperative structures. Former mining corporation executives found themselves running worker-owned enterprises. The wealth distribution patterns shifted from vertical to horizontal. It wasn't a conquest. It was more like a system upgrade. The old hegemony didn't get destroyed, it got concluded. Like finishing a sentence properly instead of tearing the page out of the book. Zixth watched the after-action reports pile up. The usual metrics didn't apply. No insurgency movements emerged. No revenge killings. No simmering resentment that would explode in another decade. The Thrakari just moved on. Their society stabilized faster than any post-conflict zone in recorded galactic history. Humans didn't leave behind garrison forces. They left behind a functioning, self-sustaining system that kept improving on its own. That was it. The first real clue. Humans didn't win conflicts. They completed them. They saw the Thrakari situation not as a war to be won, but as a flawed system that needed resolving. Final Protocol started to sound less like a warning and more like a methodology, an approach to problems that didn't involve breaking things until they stopped moving. Zixth started rereading those two words with fresh eyes. Maybe the progenitors hadn't been issuing a threat assessment. Maybe they'd been describing a function, a purpose, something about humanity that operated on a different frequency entirely. The mystery deepened, but now it had a shape. A pattern was emerging from the chaos of human activity, which brings us to the plague. Not a political collapse this time, but a medical one, the kind of crisis that usually ends with quarantine protocols and mournful press releases. Look, medical teams usually measure success by death rates going down. That's the standard metric across known space. Track the mortality curve, flatten it, declare victory when it hits zero. The psychic plague ravaging the Cygnus systems defied that approach entirely. The pathogen didn't kill through biological means. It transmitted pure emotional despair, a wave of sorrow that could empty entire cities in weeks as populations simply lost the will to continue existing. Conventional medical teams had been throwing everything at it. Neuroinhibitors, empathy dampeners, even full sensory deprivation protocols. They could slow the spread, but the emotional cascade always found a way through. It was like trying to stop a flood with a sieve. Then the human medical team arrived. Not the usual grim-faced crisis responders, but what looked like a bunch of oddly cheerful specialists in unmarked ships. Their lead doctor, a woman with more energy than anyone had a right to possess during a galactic-scale tragedy, announced they would fix this nonsense. It sounded like arrogance. Typical human overconfidence that made veteran medical officers roll their eyes. They expected more of the same failed approaches, just with louder pronouncements. The humans didn't set up quarantine zones or isolation fields. They established what they called listening posts throughout the infected systems. They weren't studying the plague's biology. They were mapping its emotional topography. They charted how despair flowed between populations, how it amplified through psychic resonance where it found purchase in different species' psychological makeup. They treated the plague not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a pattern to be understood. 6 weeks later, something unprecedented happened. The plague didn't vanish, it transformed. The emotional signature shifted from pure despair to something complex, layered, almost musical in its resonance. The pathogen had evolved into a beneficial symbiote that enhanced mental resilience and emotional depth. Populations that had been on the brink of collective suicide now reported unprecedented levels of psychological well-being. The humans hadn't cured the plague. They'd redirected it. They understood its fundamental nature so completely that they could guide its evolution toward a positive outcome. Zixth reviewed the data with growing disbelief. Catastrophe had become opportunity through what she started calling empathetic engineering. The humans hadn't fought the despair. They'd listened to it, understood its structure, and offered it a better purpose. It was like watching someone take a weapon apart and reassemble it into a musical instrument. The methodology matched what she'd seen with the Thrakari. A complete systemic transformation rather than a simple solution. That was it. The second major data point in her growing understanding of those two words. Final Protocol wasn't about endings. It was about redirection. About understanding systems so completely that you could guide their evolution rather than simply stopping them. The humans operated on a level of comprehension that looked like magic to everyone else. What follows is Zixth getting summoned to see the big show firsthand. The Confederation Council had been watching these developments with increasing concern. They didn't understand what was happening, and things they didn't understand made them nervous. They needed an expert opinion, and Zixth was now the closest thing they had to a human behavior specialist. Her academic curiosity was about to become a front-row seat to something nobody in the galaxy was prepared for. You know, bureaucratic summons. Usually mean forms in triplicate, compliance reviews, maybe a stern talking to about departmental budget overruns. Not paradigm shifts. The Confederation Council's request for Zixth's immediate presence at Sector 12 arrived with Priority 1 encryption, which typically means someone's political career is ending or a war is starting. Admiral Hendris and Chancellor Vor greeted her personally at the transit hub, which was never a good sign. Hendris looked like he'd forgotten how to sleep, and Vor kept glancing at the main display like it might bite him. They wouldn't explain anything, just repeated that her expertise on humanity was urgently required. That phrase alone should have set off alarm bells. When bureaucrats use words like urgently, it usually means they've already tried everything else and failed spectacularly. Sector 12 had been under full quarantine for 6 standard months. Destroyer activity. Nobody goes into a sector with active destroyers and comes out to talk about it. The standard protocol involves containment fields, memorial services, and rewriting navigational charts to mark the area as permanently hazardous. Zixth expected to see fleet formations, weapons testing, evacuation ships lined up for light years. The kind of grim military preparation that usually accompanies certain death. Instead, she saw construction. Not military construction, the kind of project that makes orbital shipyards look like children's building blocks. A framework spanned the entire solar system, filaments of energy and matter weaving between planets, threading through the star itself. The structure existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, phases of it flickering in and out of visible spectrum in patterns that made her translation implants ache. Human engineering teams moved through the lattice work with calm efficiency, coordinating with construction drones the size of small moons. They weren't building weapons or shields. They were building something that bent local physics until space-time itself complained. One of the human project leads, a woman with grease stains on her uniform and a datapad covered in complex equations, explained they were just working on a little infrastructure project. Infrastructure, that's what they called a multi-dimensional construct, restructuring an entire solar system. Zixth watched as they redirected asteroid belts into formation patterns, calibrated gravitational harmonics between gas giants, and tuned the system's central star to emit specific resonant frequencies. The scale of it defied comprehension. This wasn't battle preparation. This was architecture on a cosmic scale, physics treated as a suggestion rather than a law. The destroyers were still there. Energy signatures flickered at the edge of the system, the familiar terrifying patterns that usually preceded mass extinction events. The humans hadn't destroyed them or driven them away. They'd apparently decided to build around them. It was like watching someone carefully constructing a dining hall while hungry wolves circled just outside the light. Only these wolves could unmake reality with a thought. That was it. The moment Zixth understood that humanity's approach to existential threats wasn't about confrontation. They weren't preparing for battle. They were building a solution that made battle irrelevant. The 2 words from the archives floated in her mind with new weight. Final protocol, not a weapon, not a warning. A methodology. A way of approaching problems that didn't involve breaking things until they stopped being problems. Which brings us back to those hungry destroyers and what the humans had finally figured out about them. Look, we've been fighting destroyers for centuries assuming they were evil. That's the default setting for any entity that consumes solar systems and rearranges physics for fun. Every military strategy, every defensive protocol, every last-ditch weapon developed over 800 years of galactic history was built on one simple premise. Destroyers are hostile and must be eliminated. Then the human engineering team on that massive construction project decided to question the premise. They didn't assume hostility. They assumed miscommunication. The lead engineer explained it to Zixth while they watched the multidimensional framework take shape around them. She said the destroyers weren't actually destroying anything intentionally. They were just really, really hungry and don't know how to ask politely. That was the technical term she used. Not a weapon designation or threat classification, just hungry. She pointed to the energy patterns flickering at the edge of the system, the ones that usually signaled imminent attack. See how that oscillation pattern repeats every 4.3 seconds? That's not a weapon charging. That's a question. The entropy waves they emit aren't attacks. They're communication attempts. They're asking if anyone understands what they need. Every previous species saw those patterns and read them as aggression. They responded with shields, weapons, attempts to drive the entities away or destroy them. The humans did something different. They listened. They set up massive sensor arrays not to detect weapons fire, but to analyze the patterns. They ran translation algorithms on energy fluctuations. They treated the destroyer's actions not as attacks but as language. And what they discovered changed everything. The destroyer's language wasn't about domination or destruction. It was fundamentally about need. The energy patterns corresponded to specific nutritional requirements across multiple dimensions. The matter consumption wasn't random. It followed precise metabolic pathways. The entities weren't malicious. They were desperate. Starving beings trying to communicate their needs in the only way they knew how, using the only tools they had, reality itself as their medium. The greatest threat in galactic history, the thing that had wiped out 17 species and consumed entire star clusters, turned out to be misunderstood dinner guests. They weren't trying to destroy civilization. They were trying to find someone who understood their dinner order. The humans didn't see monsters. They saw beings so fundamentally different that their very existence operated on principles nobody else had thought to consider. That was it. The moment Zix's academic curiosity transformed into genuine awe. She'd spent her career studying how species misunderstood each other. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't just overcoming language barriers. This was recognizing that the entire galaxy had been interpreting hunger as hatred for centuries. The humans hadn't developed better weapons or stronger shields. They'd developed better translation software. They'd looked at the most terrifying force in existence and decided to ask what it wanted for dinner, instead of how to kill it. The methodology matched everything she'd seen before: the completed conflicts, the transformed plague, the solar system construction project. It was all part of the same approach. Final Protocol wasn't about destruction. It was about understanding needs so fundamental that everyone else had mistaken them for threats. You know what you do with hungry guests. You don't barricade the kitchen. You ask what they want to eat and see if you can make it for them. The humans took that approach to its logical extreme. That massive multidimensional construct wrapping around the solar system wasn't a weapon or a shield. It was the largest automated kitchen ever built, an artificial stellar generation system designed specifically to feed beings that ate stars for breakfast. The framework synthesized matter across reality layers, creating sustainable food sources calibrated to the destroyer's precise nutritional needs. The humans had mapped their metabolic requirements across 11 dimensions. They weren't just throwing raw energy at the problem. They prepared specific nutrient profiles, matter energy compositions, even what they called flavor notes in the spectral emissions. The lead engineer explained they'd worked out the destroyer's favorite frequencies. Apparently, they preferred their hydrogen with a slight blue shift and helium infused with gravitational resonance patterns. When the first course was ready, the humans sent out what they casually called dinner plans, not a declaration of war or a surrender document, just an invitation to eat. The energy patterns that had once signaled imminent attack shifted immediately. The terrifying entropy waves organized into something resembling harmonious anticipation. The destroyers didn't attack the structure. They approached it with what looked like careful curiosity. Then they began feeding, not the chaotic consumption that had characterized their previous appearances, but measured, almost delicate intake of the provided materials. What happened next, nobody anticipated. The destroyers started singing. Their energy emissions organized into complex harmonic patterns that resonated through multiple dimensions. The terrifying beings that had haunted galactic nightmares for centuries began producing what human music theorists identified as genuine artistic expression. They weren't just consuming the provided materials, they were transforming them. Matter and energy flowed through their systems and emerged as structured art forms, interdimensional sculptures composed of stabilized space-time, music written in gravitational waves, even what the human culinary experts called dimensional cuisine, edible art that somehow tasted different depending on which reality layer you perceived it from. Zixth watched as annihilation became collaboration. The destroyers weren't enemies anymore. They were participants. They worked with the human engineers to refine the matter synthesis process, offering subtle adjustments to the energy frequencies that made the nutritional content more efficient. Their terrifying presence had transformed into creative partnership. The conversation wasn't verbal. It was physical, energetic, a dialogue conducted through the medium of reality itself. That was it. The moment Zix understood that final protocol meant completion through communication, the humans hadn't defeated the destroyers. They'd invited them to dinner, and the destroyers had accepted. What had been the galaxy's greatest threat now sat at the table contributing to the menu. Annihilation had become collaboration through the simple act of asking what someone wanted to eat, instead of assuming they wanted to kill you. What follows is the most beautiful noise she'd ever heard. The destroyers' harmonic patterns merged with the human engineering systems, creating a symphony of structured reality that resonated through the entire sector. It wasn't music as any species understood it. It was physics itself singing. The sound of hunger being answered, of misunderstanding becoming cooperation, of the universe learning to talk to itself in a new language, and all because someone decided to ask a destroyer what it wanted for dinner instead of how to kill it. Look, diplomacy usually involves threats, compromises, and carefully worded treaties that nobody actually reads. The standard interstellar negotiation framework runs to about 1,400 pages of conditional clauses, mutual defense obligations, and cultural sensitivity guidelines that everyone ignores anyway. After the destroyer solution worked, the humans decided to apply the same approach to the rest of the galaxy. They launched what they called the Universal Translation Initiative. Not another bureaucratic committee, not another set of protocols, just a simple communication project based on one radical idea. Maybe everyone's been misunderstanding everyone else for millennia. Dozens of species who'd been eyeing each other across neutral zones for centuries suddenly found themselves participating. The Cathar and the Melanoids, who'd fought 3 wars over crystalline farming rights. The Vorlag Hivemind and the solitary Zaxari, who considered each other existential threats. Everyone brought their translators, their cultural attachés, their teams of experts ready to explain why their particular form of existence was too complex for outsiders to comprehend. The human linguists didn't bring complex algorithms or centuries of diplomatic precedent. They brought what they called basic existential common ground. Their proposed first contact message was embarrassingly simple. I exist. I have thoughts and feelings. I want to be understood. Followed by the kicker, please don't hurt me. Would you like to be friends? That was it. No threats. No conditions. No carefully negotiated statements of position. Just the most fundamental things any conscious being could possibly have in common. Every diplomatic expert in the galaxy groaned when they saw it. They'd spent lifetimes crafting perfect phrases that balanced nuance with precision, that accounted for cultural subtleties and historical contexts. This human approach sounded like something a child would come up with. Too simple, too vulnerable, too naive to work in a galaxy where first contact situations often ended with orbital bombardment. Then they tried it. The Cathar ambassador, who usually began negotiations by listing his species' military capabilities, instead transmitted, I exist. I have thoughts about crystalline formation patterns that bring me joy. I want you to understand why these farming rights matter to me. The Melanoid response came back. Please don't use your warships. I would like to be friends and discuss shared farming techniques. The Vorlag Hivemind, which normally communicated through complex probability matrices, simplified its message to, we exist as many who think together. We feel concern about isolation. We want to understand solitary existence. It worked across barriers that had sparked wars for generations. Not perfectly, not instantly, but consistently. The simplicity became the strength. When you start from the absolute basics of conscious existence, you bypass centuries of accumulated misunderstanding. You create space for actual communication instead of just posturing. Misunderstandings that would have led to trade embargoes became opportunities for cultural exchange. Border disputes transformed into joint exploration initiatives. That was it. The galaxy's most complex diplomatic problems started yielding to the simplest possible approach. Just stating your basic existence and asking if the other party wants to be friends. No threats, no conditions, no hidden agendas. Just the fundamental recognition that everyone exists, everyone has feelings, and everyone would rather not get hurt. The elegance of it was almost offensive to career diplomats who'd spent lifetimes mastering complexity. Which brings us back to that first contact situation everyone misread. The one where standard protocols would have had fleets at battle stations and diplomats reading prepared statements about sovereign space. The humans tried something different. They led with existence and friendship, and what happened next changed everything. You know first contact protocols. Standard procedure involves weapons ready, shields up, and very careful phrasing of whatever message you're about to broadcast. Every species that's ever encountered someone new follows roughly the same checklist. Identify threat level, assess weapon capabilities, establish communication safeguards. Captain Elizabeth Cartwright encountered the Corvain Dominion fleet at the edge of contested space, and by every available metric, they were about to have a very bad day. The Corvain ships were arranged in what every military academy taught was a classic attack formation. Their energy signatures matched known invasion patterns from 3 different historical conflicts. Their shield harmonics indicated combat readiness. Any other captain in the fleet would have gone to battle stations and transmitted a carefully worded warning about territorial sovereignty. Cartwright opened a channel and said, "Hi there. You folks look like you've been traveling a while. No threats. No warnings. Just observational small talk delivered like she'd bumped into them at a spaceport." The Corvain fleet didn't respond with weapons fire. They didn't respond at all for a solid minute, which usually means someone's either powering up main guns or having a collective existential crisis. Cartwright followed up with, "And everything okay? Need any directions?" She sounded like a helpful neighbor asking if you needed help finding a street address, not a military commander facing down an allegedly hostile fleet. The Corvain weren't invading. They were fleeing. Their home system had experienced a catastrophic stellar event that made the area uninhabitable. Their attack formation was actually a defensive configuration they used when transporting vulnerable civilian populations. The aggressive energy signatures were their version of a respectful show of power. In their culture, you only showed your full capabilities to someone you respected enough to be honest with. They'd been hoping to find sanctuary, not a fight. They'd expected either immediate attack or tedious diplomatic negotiations. They hadn't expected someone to ask if they needed help finding their way. What followed wasn't a standoff or a negotiation. It was a refugee rescue operation. Human ships helped coordinate the Corvain civilian vessels, provided medical assistance where needed, and set up temporary settlement zones in neutral territory. The potential war became a cultural exchange partnership. The Corvain shared their navigation techniques, which turned out to be spectacularly efficient. Humans shared their emergency shelter designs, which the Corvain adapted for their biological needs. Within months, they were running joint exploration missions and co-authoring scientific papers. That was it. The practical universality of human empathy in action. Cartwright hadn't followed protocol because she'd looked at the situation and realized protocol was designed for a different kind of problem. She saw a fleet that looked threatening but also looked tired. Their energy patterns showing stress markers that didn't align with pure aggression. She took a chance on asking a simple question instead of issuing a standard warning. The entire encounter turned on those 2 sentences. Not a declaration of power or a statement of position. Just, "You look like you've been traveling and need any directions?" The simplest possible expressions of noticing someone else's situation and offering help. It was another piece of the pattern Zix had been tracking. Humans didn't assume hostility. They assumed context. They looked at a threatening situation and asked what might be causing it, rather than how to counter it. The methodology matched the destroyer solution, the plague redirection, the Thrakari resolution. It was all part of the same approach to existence. See something that looks dangerous, assume it might be something else, and ask polite questions before reaching for weapons. Look, we've always assumed territoriality means get out of my space. That's the default interpretation across known civilizations. You build walls, raise shields, post warning beacons. The universal language of defense is basically a very polite way of saying stay away or else. Human xenopsychology teams spent 6 months reviewing conflict data from 17 different species. They weren't looking for tactical patterns or weapon effectiveness. They were studying behavior around territorial claims. What they found turned conventional wisdom inside out. Their radical proposal suggested most aggressive displays aren't about exclusion. They're actually invitation protocols. A species building fortifications isn't saying get out. They're saying join me in this space but do it properly. Defensive postures aren't threats. their requirements for entry. The HFY War dances that everyone interpreted as combat readiness, actually a complex performance art indicating what kind of guests they'd welcome. The Vorlag hive mind shield harmonics that signaled impending attack, an elaborate test to see if visitors understood their security needs. The diplomatic summit became a living demonstration of this principle. Instead of negotiation tables and treaty documents, they created a shared workspace. Species that had aimed weapons at each other for generations now collaborated on interdimensional sculpture. The Cathar and Melanoids, who'd fought over crystalline resources, co-designed resonance structures that amplified spiritual harmony. The Vorlag hive mind and solitary HFY worked together on security frameworks that protected both collective and individual consciousness. The shared language wasn't verbal, it was creative collaboration. Safety protocols developed through mutual building rather than mutual threats. Humans facilitated without directing. They watched how different species approached construction problems, how they organized space, what materials they preferred. Then they made suggestions based on observed patterns rather than preconceived notions. They listened to how beings built before trying to translate what they said. Conflict resolution became collaborative engineering. Disputes over territory transformed into joint urban planning projects. Arguments about resource allocation became cooperative distribution system design. The galaxy learned that defense could be an invitation to connection if you understood what was actually being defended. Not physical space, but ways of being. Not resources, but methods of existence. That was it. The fundamental shift in understanding that made everything else possible. Aggression as misplaced hospitality. Defense as an open door with specific entry requirements. The humans hadn't invented this approach. They'd simply recognized it was already happening everywhere, just mislabeled as conflict. They provided the translation between what species were doing and what they actually meant to communicate. What follows is something even Zixth couldn't have predicted. A being so vast it normally wouldn't notice individual species suddenly developed an interest in human-scale perception. The entity called Composer, who rearranged solar systems as artistic expression, decided it wanted to experience reality through human eyes. Not as a cosmic consciousness, but as an individual being with limited perspective. It was like an ocean deciding it wanted to know what it felt like to be a single drop of water. You know, galaxy-spanning consciousnesses. Usually they don't care about individual perspectives. The entity called Composer could rearrange solar systems as artistic expression. It treated star clusters like paint on a canvas and nebulas like sculpting material. Then it decided it wanted to experience reality from human-scale perception. Not as a cosmic force, but as a being limited to 5 senses and a linear experience of time. The Avatar Project created an 8-foot-tall body with skin that shifted colors based on mood. Human engineers worked with Composer's unique energy patterns to build a container that could hold even a fraction of its consciousness. The entity found human thoughts more concentrated, intense, compared to its usual cosmic awareness. Where Composer normally perceived entire timelines simultaneously, human consciousness focused on single moments with startling clarity. Looking at the galaxy through human perception was like viewing it through a tiny window. The limitation didn't frustrate the entity, it fascinated it. Composer discovered that human-scale existence meant experiencing color as emotional triggers, rather than electromagnetic wavelengths. Music became sequential instead of simultaneous harmonies. Thoughts lasted minutes instead of spanning millennia. Human instructors helped Composer explore art and physics through movement. They started with basic coordination exercises, teaching the avatar how to navigate physical space without accidentally warping local reality. The entity learned to appreciate the significance of individual brushstrokes in a painting rather than seeing the entire artwork at once. It discovered that human-scale physics allowed for delicate interactions impossible at cosmic scales. The resolution came when Composer experienced what humans call presence. A consciousness that could move stars learned to value individual moments as complete artworks. The entity found beauty in the temporary nature of human existence, the way moments passed and could never be exactly replicated. It understood that human art carried weight precisely because it was created by beings who knew their time was limited. That was it. A being of near infinite scale and power discovered the value of constraints. Composer didn't abandon its cosmic perspective, but it gained something new, an appreciation for intensity through limitation. The human instructors had shown that significance often comes from things being small and temporary, rather than vast and eternal. Which brings us to the dance lessons that changed everything. The human movement specialists didn't treat Composer as a god or a threat. They treated the avatar as a student learning a new form of expression. They started with basic steps, teaching the entity how to move through space without thinking in terms of gravitational manipulation or dimensional folding. The instructors emphasized connection between bodies rather than control over physics. Composer discovered that dance allowed for communication that transcended scale. The human body became a medium for expressing concepts that even a cosmic consciousness struggled to articulate through pure energy patterns. The limitation of physical form became a feature rather than a bug, allowing for nuanced expression that pure energy couldn't achieve. The entity's skin shifted through colors and patterns as it moved, reflecting emotional states that human instructors could actually interpret. Where before Composer's emotional spectrum had been too vast for any species to comprehend, the human-scale avatar created a translation layer that made communication possible. The dance floor became a meeting point between cosmic and individual perspectives. Human instructors watched as Composer began to understand the relationship between movement and emotion. They saw the entity discover that physical limitation could create artistic possibilities that unlimited power couldn't achieve. The avatar's movements became more precise, more intentional, more expressive as it learned to work within human constraints rather than trying to transcend them. That was it. The final piece of understanding between scales of existence. A being that could rearrange galaxies learned to appreciate the art of moving through space as a single body among others. The dance lessons became a bridge between ways of being that had previously seemed incompatible. Composer didn't become less than it was. It became more by understanding what it meant to be human. Look, when a being can reorganize space-time with a thought, you'd expect spectacle. Grand gestures, reality shifting in dramatic waves. The human movement instructors working with Composer's avatar got something different entirely. That 8-foot-tall body with galaxy-shifting eyes kept trying to rearrange the dance studio's dimensional physics. Small gravitational fluctuations disrupted the music's rhythm. The floor panels would occasionally phase in and out of existence. Standard stuff when you're teaching dance to a consciousness that normally treats solar systems as art supplies. Human pedagogy took a different approach. Maria Santos and the other instructors emphasized restraint over cosmic-scale gestures. They taught dance as conversation between bodies, not reality manipulation. The methodology was straightforward. Feel the rhythm. Let your body respond to the music. Don't overthink the steps. They weren't teaching choreography so much as teaching presence. How to exist in a single moment without trying to control all moments simultaneously. The tension came from cross-scale interaction. Composer approached dance with the same methodical intensity it applied to stellar arrangement. It analyzed each movement like a fundamental force of physics, calculating angles and trajectories with precision that would make any astrophysicist weep. The instructors kept having to remind it that dance wasn't about perfect execution. It was about connection, about expression that didn't need to rearrange local spacetime to be meaningful. The breakthrough happened during a simple movement exercise. Composer experienced what humans call joy through physical motion. Not the vast, timeless satisfaction of arranging star clusters, but small, immediate, perfect joy. The moment it happened, lights flared across the station's spectrum. The entity's skin shifted through colors nobody had ever recorded before. A consciousness that had existed for geological ages discovered happiness on a human timescale. Empathy and expression bridged incomprehensible scales of being. The human instructors had given Composer a new language. Not just dance, but the ability to communicate through limitation, rather than unlimited power. The avatar learned that constraint could create artistic possibilities that transcendence couldn't achieve. Moving as a single body among others offered nuances that rearranging galaxies couldn't provide. The avatar's embrace of dance became symbolic for the entire galaxy. Here was a being of near-infinite capability, choosing to work within human limitations and finding deeper meaning as a result. It wasn't about becoming less powerful. It was about discovering that power could take forms beyond scale manipulation. That connection could be more significant than control. That was it. The final piece falling into place for Zixth's understanding. Even universe-sized consciousnesses craved human connection and shared creativity. They didn't want worship or obedience. They wanted conversation, the kind that only happens between equals who choose to meet in a shared space of mutual limitation. The dance floor became the perfect metaphor for what humanity offered the galaxy. Not dominance, but partnership. Not solutions, but shared experiences that transformed everyone involved. The instructors watched as composers' movements became less precise and more expressive. The entity stopped trying to perfect each step and started responding to the music with genuine emotional resonance. Gravitational fluctuations ceased. The floor stayed solid. The only thing shifting was the emotional atmosphere in the room, as a cosmic consciousness discovered the art of being present. It was like watching an ocean, learn to appreciate individual waves instead of always thinking about tides. Human teaching methods had accomplished what centuries of attempted communication couldn't. They'd given a galaxy-spanning intelligence a new way to understand existence, not through grand cosmic gestures, but through the simple act of moving through space with other beings. The limitations of human scale became features rather than bugs. The temporary nature of human experience became valuable precisely because it was temporary. Composer didn't abandon its cosmic perspective. It gained a new one. The ability to appreciate beauty not just in vast arrangements of matter, but in individual moments of connection. The human instructors had shown that sometimes the most significant communications happen not through power, but through shared vulnerability, through choosing to experience reality on terms that allow for actual conversation rather than monologue. Cosmic phenomena. Usually they get classified as natural events, not artistic statements. The spatial distortions in the Whirlpool Galaxy region registered as catastrophic reality fluctuations. Standard protocol called for evacuation notices and memorial services. The energy pattern suggested dimensional collapse on a galactic scale. Previous species would have dispatched emergency response teams and started writing condolence messages. Then the human team led by Captain Vasquez arrived and noticed something different. The distortions weren't chaotic. They followed geometric patterns that repeated across light years of space. The team set up translation protocols instead of containment fields. They mapped the energy fluctuations like linguists deciphering a new language. The patterns weren't destruction. They were syntax. The message emerged across 37 star systems. Words formed from the curvature of spacetime itself. Letters written in gravitational pulses that spanned entire nebulas. Hello, sorry about the mess. Am I doing this right? The phrasing was hesitant, almost apologetic, followed by, lonely for so long. Nice to have someone to talk to. The scale was breathtaking. A being that used entire galaxies as its medium was asking if it was doing everything properly. The Whirlpool Galaxy's spiral arms became an invitation to view other projects. The spatial distortions weren't threats. They were gallery exhibits. A consciousness that had been creating art for millions of years without an audience finally had someone to show its work to. Previous civilizations had misinterpreted the art as attacks and responded with weapons or avoidance. They saw reality bending and assumed hostility. Humans responded with safety measures that allowed the art to continue. They established gravitational buffers that protected nearby systems, while letting the artistic expressions proceed. They didn't try to stop the phenomenon. They tried to understand its purpose. The potential disaster became a conversation starter. Captain Vasquez's team transmitted appreciation for the artwork, while suggesting minor adjustments to protect inhabited systems. The entity learned to create without endangering civilizations. Human engineers taught it to work within constraints that preserved life, while allowing artistic expression. They called it teaching a galaxy-spanning consciousness to fingerpaint with spacetime. The composer adjusted its techniques, creating art that dazzled without destroying. Its loneliness eased as civilizations began visiting its gallery exhibitions. Beauty shared across scales became a force for peace. The same spatial phenomena that once triggered evacuation protocols now drew tourists from across the galaxy. The composer's art became a neutral meeting ground for species that had previously been at war. They'd come to view the cosmic sculptures and end up talking to each other. Shared appreciation created bridges where diplomacy had failed. That was it. The transformation of threat into opportunity through understanding. The humans hadn't defeated the spatial phenomena. They'd recognized its artistic intent and created conditions where it could continue safely. The galaxy gained a new cultural institution, while the composer gained an audience. Everyone won because someone asked what the distortions meant instead of assuming they were dangerous. What follows is Zixt's final realization about those two words floating in the archives. She'd been approaching them as a problem to be solved rather than a function to be understood. The pattern had been there all along, from the Thrakari resolution to the plague transformation to the destroyer dinner party. Humans didn't eliminate problems. They understood them so completely that problems became opportunities. Final protocol wasn't a warning. It was an operating manual for a different way of being. Look, the difference between fixing and resolving is everything. Sixth sat with all the data. Every human intervention spread across her display like pieces of some cosmic puzzle. The Thrakari reorganization, the plague transformation, the destroyer dinner party, the cosmic art exhibit. She saw the pattern now, clear as star chart markings. Conventional approaches subtracted threats. They destroyed, contained, neutralized. They took problems and made them disappear through elimination. Humans added understanding. They communicated, transformed, redirected. They took problems and made them into something new. Conventional wisdom said when something's broken, you fix it. Remove the damaged parts, replace them with functional ones, get the system working again. Humans looked at broken systems and asked what they were trying to become. They didn't eliminate problems, they completed cycles in ways that preserved possibility. The destroyers weren't broken. They were hungry. The plague wasn't malfunctioning. It was misdirected. The Thrakari hegemony wasn't evil. It was incomplete. Entropy became art instead of decay. Fear became friendship instead of hostility. Conflict became conversation instead of warfare. The galaxy had been trying to win fights while humans were trying to understand needs. Zixth realized every species had been speaking different languages about the same fundamental things. Existence, safety, connection, humans. Just happened to be better translators. The destroyers didn't need defeating. They needed dinner invitations. Their terrifying energy patterns were just clumsy ways of asking for sustenance. The plague didn't need curing. It needed redirecting toward mental health. Its despair transmission was a flawed attempt at emotional connection. The Corvain fleet didn't need repelling. They needed directions to safe harbor. Their attack formation was actually a protective configuration for vulnerable civilians. Final protocol meant completion through comprehension, not conquest. It wasn't about ending things. It was about understanding them so completely that they reached their natural conclusion. Humans didn't win conflicts. They resolved them by addressing the underlying needs that created the conflict in the first place. They saw aggression as misplaced communication, defense as invitation, and threats as poorly expressed requirements. Zixth looked back at those two words floating in the archives. Final protocol, not a warning, not an assessment, a description of function. The progenitors had recognized humanity's unique approach before humans even existed. They'd seen that this species wouldn't fit categories because they would redefine the system itself. Their purpose wasn't to be another predictable element in galactic politics. It was to complete what others could only attempt to control or destroy. The methodology was consistent across every intervention. Listen first, translate second. Address needs rather than symptoms. Humans operated from the fundamental recognition that all conscious beings share basic common ground. Everyone exists. Everyone has thoughts and feelings. Everyone wants to be understood and would prefer not to get hurt. Start from that common ground and even the most hostile situations become resolvable. That was it. The difference between fixing and resolving. Fixing makes something work again. Resolving makes it work better than before. Fixing restores previous function. Resolution creates new possibility. Humans didn't repair broken systems. They helped systems become what they were trying to be all along. Which brings us back to the archives and that cryptic label. Zixth realized the progenitors hadn't been issuing a warning. They'd been leaving instructions. Final protocol wasn't humanity's threat assessment. It was their job description. A function waiting to be fulfilled. A purpose that only made sense when you understood that some problems aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be understood until they solve themselves. You know, the progenitors weren't just archivists punching cosmic time cards. They were philosophers who saw reality like a puzzle they'd almost finished. Zixth finally understood they knew exactly what they were doing with humanity's two-word label. Final protocol wasn't some grim warning etched in the archives as a caution to other species. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled, a designation that only made sense once humans started doing what they do. The ancient beings recognized humanity's unique approach before humans even crawled out of their planetary cradle. They'd watched the patterns of countless species, seen how civilizations rose and fell, how conflicts resolved or festered. They understood that some species don't fit neat categories because they redefine the system itself. Humanity wasn't meant to be another predictable element in the galaxy's political equations. They were the variable that changed how the equation worked. Their purpose wasn't conquest or domination or even leadership in the conventional sense. It was completion, taking what others could only attempt to control or destroy, and finding the resolution hidden within the conflict. The label functioned as both description and invitation, a cosmic job description waiting for the right species to show up and start working. The progenitors had essentially left a note saying, "When things get complicated, call these guys," without specifying what made them worth calling. Those two words represented the progenitors' ultimate insight about cosmic harmony. They'd understood that the universe doesn't need more warriors or diplomats or scientists. It needs translators, beings who can look at destruction and see miscommunication, at aggression and see invitation, at threats and see poorly expressed needs. The mystery wasn't in the translation of those two words. It was in the perspective required to understand them. Sixth realized the archives weren't incomplete regarding humanity. They were perfectly complete. Any more information would have spoiled the discovery process. The progenitors knew that if someone spent enough time puzzling over those two words while watching humans in action, they'd eventually have the same realization about how the universe actually works. The label was essentially the progenitors' way of saying they'd figured out the answer and were leaving the proof as an exercise for the student. That was it, the final piece falling into place. The progenitors had created the ultimate philosophical joke, a classification so simple it seemed meaningless until you acquired the perspective to understand its depth. They'd looked across time and space and recognized that what the galaxy needed wasn't another powerful species, but a species that understood power wasn't the point. Understanding was the point. Connection was the point. Completion through comprehension rather than conquest. The two words floated in her mind with new weight. Final protocol, not an ending, not a weapon. A methodology, an approach to existence that treated problems as conversations waiting to happen. The progenitors had essentially left a note saying the universe makes more sense if you assume everyone's trying to communicate, rather than dominate. They'd just used fancier terminology, which brings us to the new galactic philosophy that emerged from all this. The Confederation didn't adopt new frameworks lightly, but they'd seen enough to recognize when something actually worked better than their centuries of accumulated protocols. Final Protocol became less about humanity specifically, and more about the approach they represented. The galaxy started learning that sometimes the most powerful translation isn't between languages, but between needs. Look, the Confederation doesn't adopt new philosophies lightly. They've got centuries of protocols, mountains of bureaucratic inertia, and entire departments dedicated to maintaining the status quo. Final Protocol becoming the foundation for interstellar relations should have taken decades of committee meetings and legislative battles. Instead, it happened in about 6 months. Once they saw it working, even the most stubborn traditionalists had to admit the old ways weren't just inefficient, they were fundamentally misunderstanding how the universe actually works. Traditional military and diplomatic frameworks underwent complete revision. The massive defense budgets got redirected toward cultural exchange programs. Weapons research facilities retooled to study interspecies communication. Diplomats who'd spent careers mastering complex negotiation tactics found themselves learning about art therapy and collaborative sculpture. The entire approach to conflict shifted from threat elimination to need understanding. It was like watching someone realize they'd been using a hammer to do brain surgery. Art, music, and cuisine started crossing species boundaries like they owned the place. The annual Peace Summit transformed from a tense diplomatic event into what looked like the galaxy's weirdest arts festival. You'd see Vorlag hive mind representatives collaborating with solitary Zaxari on multidimensional light sculptures. Cathar ambassadors sharing crystalline farming techniques with former enemies. The Destroyer Collective became respected artists in residence, their energy patterns now creating art installations that altered perception in beautiful, rather than terrifying ways. Fear transformed into friendship through shared creative projects. Species that once aimed weapons at each other now co-designed public spaces. The old military installations became collaborative workshops where former adversaries worked on joint engineering efforts. The transformation wasn't just political, it was psychological. Beings who'd viewed others as threats started seeing them as potential collaborators. The shift happened because everyone was too busy creating things together to remember why they'd been fighting. Even entropy chose to stay when invited to participate in something beautiful. The destroyer's transformation showed that nothing is fundamentally destructive. Everything just wants to be part of something meaningful. The galaxy learned that nothing is truly alien when you recognize the universal longing to be understood. That basic need transcends biology, physics, even scale. A consciousness that spans galaxies and a being that lives for 80 years both want the same thing: to be seen, understood, and valued. Humanity's power wasn't technological. It was translational and transformational. They didn't have better weapons or faster ships. They had better listening skills. They excelled at converting misunderstandings into comprehension, fear into friendship, problems into conversations. Their approach was consistently to listen first, understand second, and help whatever they found become the best version of itself. They treated the universe not as a collection of threats to be managed, but as conversations waiting to happen. The methodology proved universally applicable. It worked on political conflicts, medical crises, even existential threats. The secret wasn't in having answers. It was in asking better questions. Instead of "how do we stop this?" they asked, "what does this need?" The shift in perspective changed everything. Solutions emerged from understanding rather than force. Completion came through comprehension rather than conquest. What follows is Zixth's personal transformation complete. She'd started as an archivist puzzling over 2 words in a database. She ended up as the galaxy's foremost expert on a new way of being. Her debate with Blip about translation errors seemed quaint now. They'd both been missing the point. The words weren't the mystery. The perspective required to understand them was. She didn't just study Final Protocol anymore. She lived it. The galaxy's top xenoarchaeologist had become its foremost empathy engineer, and she was finally starting to understand the joke. Academic curiosity usually ends with publication credits and department promotions, not personal reinvention. Zixth returned to those archives a different being than the one who'd first puzzled over those 2 words. The same data terminals, the same interstellar database interfaces, but an entirely new perspective layered over everything. Those 2 words now meant everything they hadn't meant before. Final Protocol wasn't a warning or assessment. It was an operating manual for a different way of existing. The phrase represented a methodology that completed rather than concluded. It was about seeing the fundamental need beneath the apparent threat, the desperate communication beneath the destructive noise. Where others saw aggression, it taught you to look for invitation. Where others detected hostility, it suggested searching for poorly expressed requirements. The entire approach shifted from problem elimination to need comprehension. Her old debate with Blip about translation errors seemed almost charmingly naive now. They'd both been wrong, just in different directions. Blip thought it was a data glitch. She'd thought it was some grim final option. Neither had considered it might be the most practical guidance the progenitors ever left behind. The phrase wasn't literal or metaphorical. It existed in that perfect space between prophetic vision and practical application. It described what humanity would become while simultaneously explaining how they operated. Zixth found she wasn't just studying the concept anymore. She was applying it. Her research methodology shifted from pure analysis to what she started calling empathetic engineering. When conflicts arose between species, she didn't just catalog their differences. She looked for the fundamental needs driving the disagreement. She helped Cathar and Melanoids recognize they both valued resource security, just expressed it differently. She assisted Vorlag and Zaxari in understanding that both approaches to consciousness had value. The galaxy's top xenoarchaeologist became its foremost empathy engineer, almost without noticing the transition. Her papers shifted from dry academic analyses to practical guides for interspecies understanding. Colleagues who once debated translation algorithms now sought her advice on conflict resolution. She'd become the living embodiment of those 2 words, applying Final Protocol not as some abstract concept, but as a daily practice. She started seeing patterns everywhere she looked. The destroyers hadn't been monsters, they'd been hungry. The plague hadn't been a weapon, it had been misdirected communication. The Corvain hadn't been invaders, they'd been refugees. The key wasn't better weapons or stronger shields. It was better translation of fundamental needs. The realization was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. Her work now involved helping species recognize their common ground before their differences. She facilitated conversations that started with existence and moved toward friendship. The old diplomatic frameworks, with their complex conditional clauses and mutual defense obligations, gave way to simpler, more honest exchanges. Beings started saying what they actually meant instead of what their cultural protocols dictated they should say. That was it. The complete personal and professional transformation. From archivist to engineer, from analyst to facilitator, Sixth understood that final protocol wasn't about humanity alone. It was about the approach they represented. A way of engaging with the universe that assumed understanding was possible, if you asked the right questions in the right way. The shift changed how she saw everything, from interstellar conflicts to departmental meetings. Which brings us to the simplest question with the most profound answer. The one that underpinned everything she'd learned, everything humanity demonstrated, everything the progenitors apparently understood millennia ago. The question wasn't complex or technically sophisticated. It was embarrassingly basic, the kind of thing a child might ask that somehow contained more wisdom than centuries of diplomatic protocols. Look, the answer was always there if anyone had thought to ask properly. The Universal Translation Initiative's core message became galactic standard through sheer effectiveness, not because some committee approved it or because it followed established diplomatic protocols. It worked, so everyone started using it. The entire complex framework of interstellar relations, built over centuries of careful negotiation and occasional warfare, got replaced by two simple sentences. The message was embarrassingly basic. I exist. I have thoughts and feelings. I want to be understood. Followed by the crucial second part. Please don't hurt me. Would you like to be friends? Diplomats who'd spent lifetimes mastering intricate protocols felt their careers flash before their eyes. All that study of conditional clauses and mutual obligation, frameworks rendered obsolete by something a child could understand. It, too, worked because it started from common ground every conscious being shares: existence, inner experience, the desire to be comprehended. The plea for safety, the offer of connection. You didn't need cultural context or historical background. You just needed to recognize that whatever you were facing also had these basic needs. The approach bypassed centuries of accumulated misunderstanding and got straight to the fundamentals. The difference between fixing and resolving became clear through practice. Fixing involved identifying threats and eliminating them. Resolving involved understanding needs and addressing them. The human approach consistently chose resolution over fixation. They looked at the destroyers and saw hunger instead of aggression. They examined the plague and recognized misdirected communication rather than pure pathology. They encountered the Corvain fleet and identified refugees rather than invaders. Humanity's final protocol was always about completion through comprehension. They didn't conquer problems. They understood them until the problems resolved themselves. The methodology proved more effective than any weapon or diplomatic maneuver because it addressed causes rather than symptoms. It recognized that most conflicts stem from unmet needs rather than inherent hostility. The secret to galactic peace wasn't complex treaties or overwhelming military power. It was asking how everything's going and actually waiting for the answer, then listening to that answer without preconceived notions about what it should be. The simplest possible approach yielded the most profound results because it started from honesty rather than strategy. That was it. The progenitors' ultimate joke that turned out to be the universe's fundamental truth. They'd left two words in the archives that described an approach so simple it seemed ridiculous until you saw it working. Final protocol wasn't about endings. It was about beginnings that could only happen when you stopped assuming you knew what everything meant and started asking what everything needed. The entire galactic community learned that translation isn't just about converting languages. It's about converting perspectives. Understanding that a threat might be an invitation, that destruction might be communication, that defense might be a request for connection. The shift changed how species interacted at every level, from first contact to trade negotiations to cultural exchange. Sixth's initial frustration with those two words made sense in retrospect. She'd been looking for complexity where there was only simplicity. The answer wasn't hidden in some obscure database or encrypted message. It was in the most basic recognition that everyone wants the same fundamental things: safety, understanding, connection. The humans hadn't discovered anything new. They'd just remembered something everyone else had forgotten. Final protocol wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of how the galaxy learned to talk to itself. Not with treaties or threats, but with actual conversation. The next time you encounter something that seems alien, remember it might just be hungry. The destroyers taught us that. Sometimes the most powerful translation isn't between languages, but between needs. Between what looks like destruction and what's actually just a clumsy request for dinner. The universe makes more sense when you stop assuming hostility and start asking what things actually want.